Hello, everybody. Welcome to day two, and thrilled to have and introduce Andy Gager. He's the CEO of AMG International, and he's going to be helping walk us through the relationship of ISO, risk management, and ISO asset management. So, Andy, I'll share your screen now, and you're good to go.
Great. Thanks very much, Josh. I appreciate that. Good day, everybody. I appreciate you taking the time to join us today. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a very high level overview of the international standard for risk management and how that's related to the ISO 55000 asset management standard. And you're going to see as we get into this, it's very high level. There's only about a dozen slides or so that will go through the different elements, but you're going to see the close relationship between the two standards. Okay, so if we can move on, just a very brief overview, of my background. Again, very brief. I have a lot of C's behind my name, which just means I spent a lot of money over the years. I was in private industry for 20 years on the operational side of the business. For the last 22 years, I've been in what I refer to as operational reliability. So I've been working with the maintenance group and the operations group to improve the overall operation. But on the bottom there, you see a list of several of the organizations that I've worked with over the years. And, if you scan through that list, there's automotive, there's steel and aluminum, there's food and beverage, there's power generation, right? There's all different types of industries that I've worked with, again, over these last, sometimes too many years. But I put those organizations on there because there is no difference in those organizations. Okay, and let me explain that. Of course, what they produce, what they convert, what they generate is different. Okay, but every single one of those organizations have assets, and those assets need to be maintained. I'd like to think of those assets as money-making equipment because that's exactly what they are. They are producing revenue for our organization. And the whole purpose and the reason behind this conference is how do we maintain those money-making assets, okay, to their design, and how do we optimize those operations? And part of the task in order for us to achieve that is risk. How do we identify risk? How do we eliminate that risk? Or how do we mitigate the consequence of that risk or the consequence of failures? So that's what I'm going to go briefly over, again, the overview of the standard. So on the next slide, what I want to do is the organizations around the world, again, mostly in Europe and Asia. And I'll talk about that when we finish this up, because I did receive an email yesterday asking me about this. But most of the organizations that I work with are in Southeast Asia or Australia. There's been a couple in Africa and one or two in Europe, but it's really sort of catching on. But it is a well-defined standard, okay? I myself, being CAMA certified, all right, I do believe that those organizations that are singular maybe focused on just the asset 55,000 asset management standard is missing a piece of the puzzle, and that is risk. And if you look at the ISO 55001 requirements, the term risk is mentioned over 45 times in that standard. Okay, So, we have to understand the relationship with the 31,000 standard with the 55,000 standard. All right. And on the next slide, um, all types of industries. Okay. And again, I gave you a sampling of some of those, but they're looking at internal, all right, risk or influences, and they are also looking at external. So managing the risk is critical, and knowing those risks, again, both internally and externally, it is vital to any organization. And so managing that risk, right, is part of leadership's responsibility, and which I'm going to talk about in just a couple of minutes. But risk and managing risk needs to be part of every organization's activities, and that awareness of risk that needs to cascade down through the entire organization. And leadership needs to make sure that the message, and we'll talk about this when I talk about communication, that they need to support it, they need to communicate it, and they need to be consistent with that support. So then on the next slide here, what I talk about are the 8 different elements, okay, or clauses. Same thing, okay, but there are 8 clauses. All right, they're listed here. Now, in regards to the ISO 55000 and the overlap between those two standards, similarities are in leadership, the integration, the allocation of resources, communication, the implementation, the evaluation, the continuous improvement. Okay, so 7 of those 8 elements overlap with the ISO 55000. That's why I truly believe you can't have one without the other. I think Frank Sinatra actually sang a song, Love and Marriage. You can't have one without the other. Maybe that should have been the title of this presentation. But you see the correlations between the two. So what I'm going to do is briefly go through those 8 elements, and then we'll put a nice little bow on it. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about leadership and their commitment. So top management is the oversight of this thing called risk management and the risk management framework. Now, I get asked a lot of times, show me the risk management framework. Okay. I am. That's the 8 elements that we're going to cover today. That is asset management framework. That is the same thing with the asset management framework in the ISO 55000. It's these in the ISO 55000, it's the 7 clauses. In the risk management, it's the 8 clauses. That's the framework. So part of leadership's responsibility, regardless of which standard they're pursuing or the elements of the standards, okay, they have to establish the policy statement. And from the policy statement, we establish, or within the policy statement, I should say, we've established the principles of the organization. So part of their responsibility then is also to ensure that we have the proper resources. And again, I'll talk about that in just a couple moments. And then they need to delegate or assign that authority, responsibility, and a really big word, by the way, this thing called accountability, right, who are going to execute that asset management or risk management framework. And again, communication is vital. Let me just mention about communication right now. Any organization that goes through an initiation or an improvement or a project or whatever you want to call it, the number one reason why organizations don't achieve the goals or the objectives of whatever that is that they're trying to do is lack of communication. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. All right, so that's leadership and their commitment. Commitment being they need to be visible as well. I guess talk the talk and walk the walk. So on the next slide, we talk about integration. So we got leadership is established this. Now, organizations differ depending on the purpose, the goals, and the complexity of the business. But as I mentioned before, there is inherent risk. and we need to manage that risk. We need to identify that risk, and we need to manage that risk. And then how do we address that risk? Okay. So organizations need to conduct a risk assessment. There's this external tool that we can use. All right. Well, there's a tool that we can use to help us identify external risk. It's called PESTLE. Of course, it's an acronym. What is the current political environment? What is the economic environment, social, technical, legal, and environment? Okay, so again, that's just a tool that organizations can use to identify potential risk external to the organization. Because look, risk changes over time, right? Whether that's leadership, or whether that's your customers, or whether it's technology, whatever the case may be, every one of those potentially is risk. So integrating the risk management into an organization is never-ending process and should be customized to meet, those, I guess, fluctuations, right? So we have to understand that. That's part of integration. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk about design. So when designing the framework for managing risk, the organization should examine and understand, as I just said, both internal and external. So when we're looking at external, what are the key drivers and trends impacting the organization from achieving their both short and long-term objectives? And I mentioned several of those, okay? When we examining internal, what is the company's vision, mission, and values? Now, that in itself is a pretty interesting topic, all right? And I'm sure everybody on the phone call can relate to this. I can speak from personal experience. My company had a vision and mission. All the companies I work for had vision and mission statements. All the companies that I work with have nice framed vision and mission statements in their reception area. But if somebody asked me, or if I ask one of the organization's employees, what is the vision and mission statement of the company? I don't think I've ever had anybody word for word regurgitate what the vision and mission statement is. They get the general idea, right? Yeah, we want to be the best in whatever we do, right? Okay, so what's the mission? I don't know. To be recognized as the best, something like that, right? So we need to understand, though, what the strategies, the objectives, and the corporate policies are. So once we understand that, okay, once we understand, what the vision is, what the mission of the company is, what are the risks to us achieving that, now we can put in plans, and now we can design those plans to address that. So on the next slide, then we talk about, do we have the right resources to execute that framework? There's a book out there called Good to Great. And let me summarize the book. Let me save you a couple hours of reading. The author states, and I agree with, it's not enough to have the right people on the right bus. We have to have the right people on the right bus, in the right seat, at the right time. So it is the responsibility of leadership to ensure that we have the right skill set, that we have the right competency. Do I have the right people on the right bus, in the right seat? And along with that, are we providing them with the appropriate tools for them to execute our strategies? In this case, our risk management strategies. So, when we go in there, not only that assurance from top management, but we must guarantee that the staff is competent. There's a difference, okay? I can have the right people, but they may not be competent, or they may not have the right skills. That's part of the equation. The right people on the right bus, in the right seat, okay? So that's the allocation. It's not just human resources. It's all these other resources that go along with it. The tools, the systems, the policies, the procedures, all that bundled together is the appropriate resources. All right, so then from the resources, then the next clause and the next element, okay, is this really important thing called communication. We cannot over communicate, okay? When I talk about leadership, one of the things that we talk to leadership is we have to develop this thing called a communication plan. What is the audience? What's the message that, and be consistent with that message. But it should be communicated, to the relevant, stakeholders in a coordinated manner. That's exactly what I just talked about. It's consistent, and is the audience the appropriate audience that we're communicating with? So the communication should build awareness of the risk management framework, all right, throughout the organization, and how it impacts the organization. Now, I do talk about this quite often. There's two languages that we talk when we're in any organization. With senior leadership, we talk money. Typically, we'll talk financial, okay? When we're on the shop floor, we'll talk what's in it for me. How does this impact me? So we have to understand that in our communication plan, all right, when we're communicating risk, what is the message that is going to be most meaningful to these individuals? Because as people, as individuals, we hear things through our sound receptacles and we filter that differently. It's amazing. We can stand there and say the sky is blue, but some people interpret that and filter that and process that to say, I'm pretty sure that Andy said the sky is green. So communication is incredibly important. So, that strategy and how it's implemented and how it impacts individuals needs to be clearly defined. So from communication, then we're going to lead into the next slide here, the next stage, okay, of the standard, and that is how do we implement this? So successful implementation of the risk management process requires the engagement and the attentiveness of its stakeholders. Just like I said, the conduit to that is our communication. So therefore, the leaders have to plan, which we talked about. They need to implement that correctly. Okay. Now, let me just take a quick step back. There's a saying that we use: we can implement a mile wide and an inch deep, and we haven't changed any behaviors or any culture. Or we can implement a mile deep and an inch wide. Okay. And when we hit that point, we've embedded the changes into the culture of the organization. That's what we want to do. That leads to sustainability. And then when properly designed and implemented, risk management, all right, the framework is going to ensure that the processes is part of all of our other activities, right? And at every level, both internal and external, this will be appropriately addressed whenever we identify this. So this is actually a pretty important point right here. So after implementation, we need to monitor it. Okay, so we need to put in, again, So we need to make sure that what we're doing is doing what we want. Here I talk about KPIs, key performance indicators, metrics, measures, whatever you want to call it, right? I've worked with enough organizations that manipulate those results to make themselves or the process or the organization look better. I never used key performance, when I was a plant manager, I never used key performance indicators as a disciplinary tool. I use them to say, are we doing the right things or are we not doing the right things? Are we meeting our objectives? Are we meeting our goals? And if we're not, time out. Let's get together and figure this out, because it ain't doing what we want it to do. Okay, so let's figure this out. What activities are we going to put in place to address that? So in order to evaluate the effectiveness of the risk management, The organization must consistently and routinely measure the performance against the purpose of what it is that we're trying to achieve: goals, objectives, milestones. So leadership must then determine whether or not it remains appropriate in attaining those objectives. Because remember, we all work in a very fluid world. Okay, very few organizations, it's static over the course of years. We are constantly in a state of flux. So from the evaluation, then that's going to lead into, I think, continuous improvement. So how do we do continuous improvement? What do we put in place? So the definition, right, of improvement is something that enhances value or excellence. So what is management? I'm not going to just pick on management. The whole organization, really. We want a culture of 5 whys. We want everybody in the organization to ask and anybody who's got a 2 or 3-year-old kid knows what I'm talking about, because they don't ask 5 why, they ask 1,000 whys. And at some point we just say, because I say so. But we need to continually improve, okay, the suitability, all right, and the adequacy and the effectiveness of what it is that we're trying to do. Risk mitigation, risk elimination. Here's the tricky part. We need to balance 3 things when we're doing evaluations, all right, for this risk and implementation of any new process or any risk mitigation. What is the cost of doing this? Or what is the cost of not doing this? What is the impact of us doing this on performance? By doing this, have we increased or decreased risk? Because there are some things that we put in place, there are some changes that we make that actually increases or generates a new risk downstream or potentially upstream. So it's a balancing act: cost, performance, risk. So and it's continuous, and as we continually evaluate, all right, our processes or our organization, we identify or gaps will show up or creep up. It's how do we respond to those gaps, all right? And then the next slide there, in summary here. So I do know I'm running a little, so let me just summarize here. Okay, organizations must have policies, processes, and the tools applicable to manage risk. And so some of those tools that we can use is asset criticality analysis. So what truly is the most critical assets in our organization? Because those will have the largest impact, right, when we talk about failures. So what truly is? Because I can tell you right now, if I have 5 department supervisors in the room, and I ask that question, whose equipment is the most critical, I'm going to have all 5 supervisors respond, my equipment is the most critical, because that's who I'm responsible for, that equipment. So therefore, my equipment is the most critical. Okay. We need to use some methodology to determine truly what is the most critical assets or the most critical systems. When we do that, we need to identify potential risk or potential failures, failure modes. We can use these tools called failure modes and effects analysis or failure modes, effects, and criticality analysis. That helps determine our maintenance strategies to eliminate or mitigate risk or reduce the consequence of those failures. We can also apply reliability-centered maintenance. Now, if we do experience a failure that we did not capture on our FMEA or our FAMICAs or in our PMs, or our PDM strategies, we need to conduct a root cause failure analysis. And what mitigation are we going to put in place? What task are we going to put in place to address that failure mode? And during the design phase, let's move it all the way back to the design phase, keeping in mind that 90 to 95% of equipment reliability and maintainability is baked in at the design stage. Perhaps we go down the road of Six Sigma and looking at DMAIC development. Okay. So, then finally, we must have documented processes and procedures, because I've always said that people come and people go, which is true. People come and people go. All right. It's the processes that we put in place that are going to ultimately stabilize, all right, our practices, well, it's the policies and procedures that we're going to put in place that stabilizes overall the system. All right. So that's really what I wanted to cover. Again, very high level. Okay. There's a lot more, but I hope that you see that I hope you understand why I say I don't think organizations can fully implement ISO 55000 without fully understanding the risk management aspect of it. All right.
And that was awesome. And a few, let's say, takeaways for me was on, absolutely understanding the risk management, risk mitigation sightings, that leadership comment that you made of, you've always got to be present, be visible, and then communication, right? So those were my personal takeaways. And we do have a question from Kashif here, and
Yep.
He's saying, how can we link risk management associated with physical assets and the organization?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I hope I talked about that when I talked about conducting FMEAs or FAMICAs or RCM, because once we identify, because we're certainly not going to conduct, and anybody who's ever sat in on an FMEA workshop or a FAMICA workshop, it could be pretty painful. You get 12 angry people in a room, but once we identify really the assets, the critical processes, or the critical systems, that's when I can link our risk assessment to our physical assets, and we can determine the most appropriate maintenance strategies to address that risk. And again, ultimately, our goal is to eliminate that risk or mitigate or minimize the potential failure or the consequence of that failure. I hope that answers your question.
Awesome. It certainly sounded like it. And I just want to put your contact details on there. So everybody, and you could connect with him here on the LRVS app as a speaker, as his website and phone number there. So much for sharing your knowledge with us today. And thank you, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for taking the time. Cheers.